So good morning. So thank you for joining us for this session, which is run as part of the University of Leicester's Refugee with Breaking Barriers that happens yearly, the first week of March. So my name is Pascal Roussel. I work for the Sanctuary Seekers Unit, and I'm the main organizer for Breaking Barriers. So this morning, we will be focusing on our Sanctuary Scholarship for Distance Learning academic programs. And I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Helen Dexter from the School of History, Politics and International Relations, who was the person who launched those Sanctuary Scholarships at the university. So a bit of a pioneer, really. Actually, just before we go on to Helen, I'm just going to very quickly go through the housekeeping rules. So participants will not be able to unmute themselves. That's just to avoid you showing on the recording, as you may not want to show since we will upload the video on YouTube later. So please use the chat box if you have any comments, questions, concerns. You can also send a direct message to my colleague Jacqueline, who will be looking after the chat if you have any issues. And so, as I say, we will record this session, and once it's been uploaded, we will send a link to all participants, and we will also add the link to our website. If you have any queries after this session, please email sanctuary@le.ac.uk. And now over to you, Helen.
Thank you very much. So my name's Helen Dexter. I'm Associate Professor of International Politics in the School of History, Politics and International Relations. Although I teach international relations, I just wanted to say from the outset that I'm not an expert in migration or refugee studies. So I'm speaking today as somebody that's been looking after a distance learning program for a few years, and that's the kind of experience that I'm bringing in terms of working with displaced people and forced migrants. I'm still learning every day. So, Pascal, I have to ask you to change the slides, I think, or can I do it myself? There we go, brilliant. Okay, so just a quick overview of what I'm going to speak to today. I just wanted to basically introduce the Sanctuary Scholarships that we run in our distance learning programme, just to give a little bit of global context, first of all, about the role of distance learning in facilitating access to higher education. And then to just talk about what our distance learning Sanctuary Scholarships look like, what our DL programme looks like. I wanted to talk about the guiding principles on Sanctuary Scholars in UK higher education, because obviously we're working within these principles. And I think hopefully, you know, what we're trying to do with this session today is encourage other schools and other universities to use their distance learning programs to help open up access to higher education. I just wanted to kind of make these principles known, that this is the context in which we're working in. And then just to speak a little bit about what Hyper have learnt so far since we launched these scholarships. Okay, so in terms of the global context then, according to data that's been gathered by the UNHCR, only around 5% of refugees globally have access to higher education. And the UNHCR are trying to increase this number to 15% by 2030. So there's a real need to facilitate access to higher education for refugees and asylum seekers. And higher education in particular has been described as a broken pipeline for refugees. So an increasing body of research then demonstrates that primary and secondary education for refugees has been prioritised, whilst access to higher education remains limited. I found much less research looking at postgraduate education as well, so I can only assume that access to postgraduate education is even more limited. And I should say that our distance learning scholarships are for postgraduate courses, they're for our MAs. So facilitating access to higher education for sanctuary seekers helps individuals themselves. I strongly believe it's a real benefit to universities as well. I think our distance learning programme is much better for widening access as far as possible. We know as well that refugees, asylum seekers are often really active in local communities. I know that's definitely the case in Leicester as a city. And I know from some of our sanctuary scholars on the DL programme that are based all around the world that they're trying to improve not just their own lives, but of those that are around them as well, often refugee communities. So we, access to DL can help individuals, it can help local communities, it can help to support capacity building in developing countries or areas that are recovering either from conflict or humanitarian disaster. So there's a real need to open up access to higher education. So we're doing this within the context of the universities of sanctuary. Leicester is a university of sanctuary. There are currently, I think, 23 universities of sanctuary in the UK. Each institution is developing its own approach to facilitating access to higher education. So there are different programmes on offer, different ways that universities are trying to help. From what I know, I think sanctuary scholarships, where they are offered, tend to focus more on campus-based learning. And these scholarships obviously are welcomed and encouraged. This is definitely not an either-or situation where we should be moving to DL rather than campus-based. But I do think that the distance learning, and particularly the growth of DL in UK higher education, there really is an untapped opportunity here to widen access even more. So to those that have been displaced or continue to face serious barriers to access to education. So I don't think, I'm not arguing for kind of DL scholarships in any way to replace those that exist on campus, but I think they can be a really good addition to what we can do. So DL brings lots of benefits with it. So obviously we can open up access to people that are not just seeking sanctuary in the UK, but are based anywhere in the world. And also, you know, often even when people reach host communities, they're often moved around quite a lot and at short notice. And obviously DL helps to overcome some of the difficulties around that as well, and that you can take your distance learning with you. I mean, that makes it sound much easier than it is in practice, but there are definitely benefits to distance learning that can add are a good addition to these campus-based sanctuary scholarships. Okay, so there was a really useful report in 2016 by the Refugee Support Network and Jigsaw Consulting that suggested that access to higher education for refugees had a number of significant impacts. So I won't read all of these out, but certainly there's evidence to suggest that it can be beneficial for employment opportunities, developing new skills, new language skills, and certainly involvement in education can improve mental well-being. These new skills are often translated into community projects. And there was also evidence to suggest that higher levels of engagement in higher education are also resulted in improved cross-cultural understanding. So there is very clear benefits to widening access as far as possible. So distance learning as well has been noted to play a role in this. So here's a quote from the Global Framework for Refugee Education in 2019, where the UN was noting that online education and other innovative methods can help to overcome obstacles. So certainly, there's already evidence to suggest that DL can play a really important role and is playing an important role in widening access. Okay, so that's the kind of broad, very quick overview of some of the context. DL in our School of History, Politics and International Relations then. So we launched the scholarships in 2018. I'd been reading about Kieran campus and different kind of DL distance learning and online initiatives that were going on in Germany and elsewhere. And I was running a DL program and just thinking that maybe we could do something to help as well. So this was all in the context of humanitarian crises that had kind of developed out of conflict in Syria. And So I figured, well, all somebody really needs is access to the internet, and then we could have them join our MA program. And I really was kind of that naive at that stage that maybe there was something that we could do here that might be helpful. So we were lucky enough that our scholarships were approved, and we launched them in 2018. And I think, and Gabby can probably correct me if I'm wrong after I've stopped talking, but this was the first accredited distance learning sanctuary scholarship in the UK. So there's lots of really good initiatives using online learning, helping refugees, asylum seekers and others access online learning, but this was the first time that a scholarship was available for an accredited postgraduate degree. So our DL program in Hyper is taught entirely online through Blackboard. We provide students with weekly reading lists and other materials, questions, exercises, and they're guided by a course tutor to help them kind of critically engage with that literature. And debate and discussion is at the heart of how we teach. So we try to use a social constructivist approach to education where students are learning with each other and from each other, and that it is discourse and debate based. So it's not a DL program where we just provide lots of materials and students kind of go away and learn on their own. Our aim is to try and create a sense of community. Okay, so our students then on our scholarships can be based anywhere in the UK, or they can be based anywhere in the world. And we do have sanctuary scholars all over the world. We try to use the language of forced displacement in the way that we've put these scholarships together, rather than specifying refugee or asylum seeker. This is because legal definitions can be quite restrictive and they differ from country to country. And as I said, there are benefits that come with distance learning. And one is that we don't have to worry quite so much about visa issues or kind of Home Office imposed restrictions on who we can provide these scholarships to. So I think that we do have a lot more discretion in terms of how we can award these scholarships by the fact that they are distance learning. Okay, and I just wanted to kind of focus a little bit on the language of forced displacement, because Universities of Sanctuary also encourage us to use this language to talk about forced migrant rather than specifying refugee or asylum seeker. And they give 3 reasons for using this language. So they said that it reflects and encompasses the many diverse and complex immigration statuses that exist in respect to forced migration. That it intends to transcend the numerous and often pejorative stereotypes associated with such statuses, and that the word forced reflects the fact that displacement experienced is due to events and circumstances beyond the individual's control. So that's something that we decided to adopt when we set the scholarships up, was to try and make the most of the flexibility and the freedom that distance learning brings, that's perhaps not available to campus-based sanctuary scholarships. Okay, so how did we go about selecting our sanctuary scholars? So I put together just some short guidance of really of kind of what we've learned along the way in terms of how we go about selecting our sanctuary scholars. Our sanctuary scholars should be qualified for the MA in exactly the same way as our other applicants are. So, you know, sanctuary scholars are as equally academically capable as our other applicants. We also decided from the outset that we'd work on a basis of trust, and if and when necessary to kind of verify in terms of the documents that applicants have to provide for us. So we kind of tried to work on the assumption that applicants might not always be able to have access to certificates and that sort of thing. So as far as possible, we tried to take individual circumstances into consideration and basically work on the basis of trust as far as we can. We had to think really carefully about how we were going to consider each application. Early on, we realized that we couldn't turn this into a competition about kind of which applicant had had the most traumatic or worst experience in terms of how we work through these applications, and instead we've tried to focus on barriers to access to education. So who's faced clear barriers, and how can this MA in particular help them overcome that particular barrier to education? And I think we're still learning every time we go through this process with the applications. You know, we try to learn about different circumstances, about where applicants are based, whether they would have more access to higher education if they're now based in Germany, or if they're based in Malaysia, or, you know, like I said from the beginning, we're learning as we do this. So each time we assess applications, we have to try and educate ourselves in order to kind of make these assessments. But essentially, we're looking for barriers to education and how we might help overcome, you know, one or some barriers to help them access education. We look for candidates where we can see a really good reason for them to study for this MA. This isn't necessarily just reduced to improving their career development. You know, this is also, you know, I take just somebody's general well-being, their health, their mental health, to me is just as important as to why somebody would want to study for an MA than simply, you know, whether we can see a career development or anything like that. And then we have the discretion to award MA scholarships for perhaps different programs within our distance learning suite than the one that they applied for. So we will kind of look at all the applicants, look at the programs on offer, and then we'll see if we can fit people to degrees that we think would be suited to them. Okay, so I'm not going to kind of read each one of these out loud, but I did just want to kind of raise awareness of these guiding principles on sanctuary scholars in higher education. This is these are the principles that we're working within as a University of Sanctuary, and also our little DL program when we try to manage these scholarships and think about what we're doing. So I'll just go through them. Pascal, as a heads up, we'll kind of skip through these relatively quickly, but obviously the first principle is the right of forced migrants to higher education. So every human being has a right to education. I don't see our sanctuary scholarships as kind of charity or anything like this. This is a human right that we're simply helping to kind of facilitate. But certainly, you know, this is the kind of the basis of everything that we do, that forced migrants absolutely have a right to access higher education. Okay, so the second guiding principle is equal treatment and non-discrimination. So sanctuary scholars should be treated equal to all other students. Also, the right to privacy obviously is really important. So our sanctuary scholars have a right to privacy. You know, this is something that we take very seriously in terms of how we discuss our scholars. I try not to retell stories or personal circumstances in situations where we shouldn't. So obviously, right to privacy is very important. So in terms of sanctuary universities of sanctuary, part of our responsibilities as a University of Sanctuary is to try and keep providing opportunities for sanctuary scholars to access higher education. So clearly this sits within the University of Leicester as a University of Sanctuary's mission, is to try and provide access. Okay, so the fifth guiding principle then is the underlying principles for design, administration and implementation of sanctuary initiatives. And this is something that I keep going back to, because obviously in the first kind of instance, it was just, we can try and set up these scholarships, but obviously that's almost the easy part. Well, it is the easy part really, because then once we have sanctuary scholars on our programs, that's when our real responsibility to them kicks in. And this is the part where I'm still learning all the time about how we can do better. But certainly once we have sanctuary scholars on our program, we need to kind of give due consideration to their particular experiences, to their needs, and to make sure that our program of study is suitable for their needs as well. So this is something that, you know, our responsibility to those sanctuary scholars doesn't kind of end with simply allowing them onto the program and the fee waiver. We need to make sure that we're supporting them throughout their studies with us. Okay, so Principle 6 then again kind of comes back to this. So it's about selection processes and removal of procedural barriers. And this is something again that we're learning as we go along. But in particular, making sure, we says here that higher education institutes should work towards removing all barriers that may impede the ability or capacity of sanctuary scholars to begin, continue or complete their studies. And it's the kind of continue and complete their studies that I still think that we have room for improvement on, and that we're this is where where I'm kind of focusing my attention at the moment, to make sure that simple kind of procedural things, whether it's, so one of our biggest challenges has been around mitigating circumstances and making sure that our processes are not putting undue pressure on our sanctuary scholars, and that we're shaping our program to meet their needs as well. So this is maybe something we can pick up in conversation afterwards, but certainly kind of just launching the scholarships was definitely the easy bit, and this is where we're kind of paying attention to now. Okay, so all the communications should be clear as well, and again, that's something that we're working on. Pastoral care as well. Again, this is something that I know the Sanctuary Seekers Unit is working on, and something that we're really keen to improve as well. That the programs kind of give consideration to the specific and individual needs of each sanctuary scholar. And I think this is possibly something that we can talk about in the conversation after the presentation as well. And student progression and participation as well. So again, so to enable and encourage sanctuary scholars to fully participate in the academic and social communities. And again, distance learning obviously brings benefits, but there are also difficulties as well. So building community within distance learning is a challenge. It's something that I think is possible, and we're paying careful attention to how we make sure that sanctuary scholars are able to kind of fully participate in the social communities that we do create. Okay, yeah, and staff training as well, but we'll skip over that one, I think, for now, Pascal. Okay, so that's the kind of global context and the principles that we're working within. Our sanctuary scholarships are a simple fee waiver. How much scholarships kind of cost obviously is going to depend on the model of distance learning that we're using. We don't think that adding a sanctuary scholar should take a place away from anybody else on a program, and really adding one more student into a distance learning program shouldn't increase the costs significantly. Obviously it does depend on how you kind of the cost model of your distance learning, but ideally with DL it should be easier and less costly to bring sanctuary scholars into this program. Sanctuary scholars do require investment in time, both from academics and support staff as well. And I'm really grateful for the whole team around DL that work with me, that have really embraced this and kind of see the positive in what we're doing. So I'm not suggesting that there aren't kind of implications for setting up these sanctuary scholarships, but certainly they shouldn't be so overwhelming that that kind of rules out setting them up in the first place. Okay, so experiences so far, then we've had around 97 applicants for our sanctuary scholars for distance learning. We've awarded 29 scholarships so far, and 5 of our sanctuary scholars have graduated. We do find that sanctuary scholars can take longer to complete, so our part-time MA is 2 years. Obviously, sanctuary scholars have incredibly complicated and difficult, challenging things to be dealing with, as well as their education. So we try to be as flexible as possible. We have suspension policies in place that means that sanctuary scholars can pause their studies if they need to and rejoin us. As is the case with distance learning students, no 2 sanctuary scholars are the same. You know, it is about meeting individual needs rather than trying to make assumptions about any of our DL students, really. We find that digital competencies differ significantly, as does knowledge and experience of higher education, either in the UK or elsewhere. and language abilities differ as well. So it really is about kind of dealing with everybody as an individual as far as possible. Okay, so we are learning lots of lessons. The most important, I think, being that getting the scholarship in place was really kind of just the start. So we're learning that that we have to have really clear and simple communication in how we talk about the scholarships, and throughout our whole DL program as well. I think it's made us think again about our learning environment, about our pedagogy as well, about how we teach and why we teach, and making sure that so I think trying to make the program accessible to sanctuary scholars has basically benefited the program overall, because it has made us kind of reassess not just our communication, but the learning environment entirely. We need to make access to support as easy as possible and be able to signpost people where necessary. We're learning to look at the bigger picture and not to try and let administrative processes get in the way of learning and access. We do not ask sanctuary scholars to be grateful in anywhere. We don't share their stories without permission. We don't use their images without permission. This is not a PR exercise for us. We try and be very aware of trauma, but we don't want to reduce our sanctuary scholars just to stories of trauma. We don't insist that sanctuary scholars share personal testimony at any point, and this is about thinking through simple exercises such as kind of introduce yourself to your peers or tell us about your life or your family or things like this. So again, we're learning from the Sanctuary Seekers Unit about trauma-informed education and how we can use that. We're trying to be aware of when subject matters might be triggering. Obviously, we teach international relations, human rights, we teach about conflict. These are all subjects that could be difficult for some of our sanctuary scholars to engage with. And we also try to be aware that we might be part of the trauma as well. So trauma is not something that happens just in war-torn countries. We are very much part of what can be a very hostile environment for sanctuary seekers, and so we try and acknowledge that, and yeah, I think we acknowledge that and see how we can operate better. Okay, so I am almost finished. I just wanted to say one of the things that launching the scholarships has prompted me to think more carefully again about kind of how we teach and why we teach. I think that sanctuary scholarships are part of inclusive education, but simply being inclusive, so simply allowing people to access education, isn't enough. I do think that sanctuary scholarships are not apolitical. We have to kind of trouble this category of host and guest and think very much in terms of rightful presence, that our sanctuary scholars have a rightful presence. They have a right to be part of this education. So we have a responsibility to create conditions where sanctuary scholars and all of our students can be equal knowledge producers. So this is very much about, how we teach and not just what we teach or who we teach. And just to point you to some resources then, so when I started out, I used Article 26, which is now part of Universities of Sanctuary. They have really good resources that we've drawn on from everything from the principles that we work within, and application forms, how we select sanctuary students. Obviously, you can contact me if you'd like to chat about our experiences after this presentation, so that my email address is there on the screen. And I've put up the reference there for the Refugee Support Network reports that we drew on at the start of the presentation as well. So I think I'll stop talking for a bit now.
Thank you, Helen. And now we have Jacqueline Kirk from the School of Business, who have just launched a Sanctuary Scholarship for some of their masters. So she will talk to us for a little bit about this.
Thank you very much, Pascal, and thank you, Helen. Helen and I have actually been working quite closely on developing the ULSB, the School of Business scholarships, because what we've set up is very much on the back of the success that was developed in politics. And if we just go? Yeah, that's fine. And so having said that, I still find it immensely helpful to have listened to that presentation as well, Helen, because there are additional things coming through there that I think is really important information for us at the stage that we're at, which is very much early days. I mean, as you said, actually getting the scholarships in place to an extent is the easy bit, and that's where we're at the moment. Having had our scholarships approved, we're now entering that more difficult part in actually bringing the scholars in. So my presentation is fairly short, given at the stage that we're at in our scholarship journey. I'm just going to run through 4 key aspects. So firstly, looking at how we as a School of Business first linked into University of Sanctuary. Then moving on to discuss the process of setting up the scholarships. So a little bit more around the kind of nitty-gritty of actually what was involved in getting those scholarships approved in the first place. Obviously, that will be fairly institution specific. So if you're viewing this presentation from another institution, there might be slightly different processes necessary in your institution, but generally I think it's fairly relevant across the board. And then finally moving on to look at the scholarships that we now have available that we are currently launching and our next steps as we progress into that next stage. Thank you, Pascal. Come to the next slide. Great. Okay, so I should probably have introduced myself. So my name is Dr. Jacqueline Kirk. I'm a lecturer in international business at the University of Leicester, a School of Business. As part of my role, I'm also the school's sustainability lead, and it's through that role that I actually linked in with University of Sanctuary a fair while ago now, actually. The reason for that link was actually the relevance of University of Sanctuary, and particularly the idea of scholarships, to our commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals, particularly Goal 4 around quality education. And in regards to the Sanctuary scholarships, it was particularly interesting in terms of how we could demonstrate our commitment to more inclusive and equitable education, which is very, very much critical to that that particular goal, progressing the equal access inherent in education, and particularly focusing on University of Sanctuary as a category of scholarships, category of people that are potentially vulnerable in facing those barriers to education. So it was through that role of focusing on sustainability and our commitment to the UN Sustainable Development Goals and our commitment to UN Principles for Responsible Management Education as well, that I first became involved in discussions around Sanctuary and scholarships. Having been introduced to the Sanctuary team and to Helen and hearing about her experiences, we decided as a school that DL, or flexible learning, as I think we phrase it in our school, was the most relevant channel to take, at least initially, for our scholarships, principally because of the many of those benefits that Helen so eloquently listed in her presentation around the ability for individuals to be able to access this regardless of their geographical location. And so it was principally through our flexible learning programs that we have focused our scholarships so far. Pascal, can I have the next slide, please? I think. Okay, and so we then set about a number of procedural targets that we needed to achieve in order to get those scholarships initially approved. This began with obviously liaising with Helen in politics and international relations to understand what key processes they had in place. And that decision around focusing on flexible learning and DL within the school also. That led into a process whereby we developed a business case, or a proposal, if you like, for the scholarships from within the school. That was developed by myself in collaboration with our distance learning, flexible learning lead. And that, having got that proposal in place, that was then submitted to our school learning and teaching committee for consideration. Having achieved approval at that stage, it then needed to go to our senior leadership team within the school, at which point it then moved on to college level. So you can see there's a number of kind of hurdles that we had to pass through in order to get the scholarships approved in the first place. Having gained authorization at a college level, we then required central approval from the institution. And all in all, I think, having looked back, I think overall this was roughly a 2-month process from start to finish, if we look at having that first approval from the Learning and Teaching Committee right through to that central approval. But I would say the process itself was actually quite a bit longer than that, because I personally found it was necessary to get the right political will within the school even to have these scholarships approved, and that was quite a nuanced process in developing that and having those conversations with different individuals to create that buy-in initially. So although the actual dot-to-dot process of getting the approval was 2 months, the groundwork that went in before that was a little bit more extensive. So this is a place that we're at now. We have a number of scholarships approved for our programs. We have 4 annual scholarships approved across our distance learning programs. I'll talk a bit more about the specifics in a bit more detail in a moment. And we're at the stage where we're trying to get those applications in. So we're hinging on a point around decisions around marketing. How do we get the news out there to applicants that we have these scholarships available? And again, this isn't necessarily a simple, there's no simple answer to this, because as I've found in conversations with colleagues, there's a need for a balance in how we market these, because in one sense, we obviously want to get those applications in, but we are also constrained by the resources that we have in processing the applications as well. So although we want as many people to apply as possible, we also need to be mindful about our ability to process those and get those scholarships in place. So currently we're focusing our marketing fairly from within the realms of the university, if that makes sense. So it's mainly through a web page that's present on the university websites and an application form that will be embedded in that, which replicates very much the application form in politics, and some further communications through the University of Sanctuary team. Okay, thank you. So looking at the specifics, initially when we first looked at doing Sanctuary scholarships, it were part of the draw was, I think, links into what Helen was saying before. This is a co-benefit here. It's not just about the recipient gaining from the scholarship. It's also the university that gains from having these people in our programs as well. And our risk, crisis and disaster management distance learning program was highlighted as being particularly relevant here, given some of the experiences that these individuals may have undertaken. But we were also quite conscious that that was quite limiting. So just because individuals had experienced or may have experienced risk, crisis or disaster, that didn't define them as individuals. They might want to study finance, they might want to study human resource management, they might want to study something else within our programs. And so we tried to make sure that they had access to a broad suite of programs as much as we possibly could. Currently, we have an issue with our making this applicable to our MBA because of the requirement for candidates to actually come to campus for a certain point of time, which makes it more problematic. We're hopeful that that won't be insurmountable and we can hopefully progress beyond that and include that at a later stage. But for now, the 3 main programs that we are focusing on are our human resource management and training by distance learning, our finance by distance learning, and of course our risk, crisis and disaster management by distance learning as well. So as I say, we have 4 scholarships available across 1 year, but they are they will be appointed across the year. So it comes in a rolling sense. So we take applications continually. If that okay. Next slide, please, Pascal. So next steps. So as I say, we are just at the end of, I think, what is the easy bit of getting these scholarships up and running and heading into the more complicated aspects of actually getting these scholars on board, and then supporting them through their programs as they go forward. our next steps are obviously to get those applications in, assess those, and get some sanctuary scholars studying with us. And as I say, continuing to work very closely with our colleagues in politics and international relations who have done such a great job with their scholarships so far. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline. All right, well, now I think we have a bit of time for any questions our attendees may have. So if you want to use the chat box to ask any questions, that would be brilliant. And while people have a think about potential questions, I think we have Gabby with us in the audience who would like to share some information that also is relevant to this section.
Okay, thank you, Pascal. Oh, that was a bit of an echo. Okay. So first of all, just to say that was a fantastic presentation by Helen, and very exciting what Jacqueline is doing to follow up on the work that's being done in Hyper. I think it's such a courageous thing to do, actually, because it's just not within the typical frame of reference for universities to operate like this. My role in this is very peripheral. I'm doing my PhD at the moment through Lancaster University as a distance learner based in Leicester. And my case study for my PhD, which is in the area of higher education, is on this particular sanctuary scholarship for forced migrants on the Hyper program. So I'm looking particularly at the concept of student engagement, which has been a big topic in higher education for more than 10 years, and is moving more towards looking at online engagement. And my particular interest is in the widening participation kind of aspect of it. So I started doing my first interviews in, I think, July 2019. I had a few, had to stop work on it a few times over the last few years due to things happening, pandemic and work pressures and so on. But I'm pressing on, and at the moment I am in the process of analysing the data. So with support from Helen and the admin team on the Hyper program, I was able to have messages sent out to all the sanctuary scholars in 2019 and 20, inviting applicants, sort of interested people, to be research participants in my study. 10 signed up for it, and so I've been talking to those 10 individuals. My study is very qualitative, in-depth. I'm not trying to gain any huge sort of quantitative insights or anything. And basically, I've had 2 interviews with each of those 10 individuals, and with some of them I've had a lot more contact, weekly or more, over this period of time, partly because I offered support as a study buddy. This is not my subject area, but I know a little bit about writing assignments and structuring assignments and academic integrity and those things. So I offered study buddy support, and on that basis I've had a few of them communicate with me quite regularly. So they're scattered all over the world. Our communication means mainly we communicate through WhatsApp. Some of them use Skype. We've had some Zoom interviews. But I think what I'll tell you, just in summary, because it's very early days in terms of my data analysis, but in summary, initially I thought I was going to be getting a snapshot of 10 learners at a certain point in time in their journey through this online program. But because it dragged out so much longer for me than originally planned, it actually sort of turned into a bit of a bonus, because now I can do almost a longitudinal view of the students, particularly the ones who started a lot earlier in the process. So now I'm able to kind of map their journeys. I'm using the capability approach as my main conceptual framework, and I'm using some conceptual frameworks from student engagement, and I'll be really happy to talk more about these when I've got a bit further down the line in my study. But what's come up in looking at the student's journey through the program is it's clear there are 4 routes basically through the program, and I'm doing this because I've got a flow chart that starts at the bottom and goes up. And there's a branching off point that comes at some point in the program for all of them. There's the option 1 or 2, outcomes 1 or 2. Outcome 1 is graduation as anticipated, right? Outcome 2 is the choice not to graduate, because using the capability approach, you see it from the perspective of everybody uses their own agency and makes decisions as they go along. And they might have all the opportunities in place to actually complete the program and graduate, but they make a decision not to. So far, nobody's made that decision. So we have, out of my 10, we've got 3 who've achieved graduation, which is fantastic. And then we've got a couple on the other side who were almost forced to either stop the program or reconsider. And in their cases, they had overwhelming barriers, overwhelming negative conversion factors in the sort of conceptual framework. And those were, some of them were most of them entirely predictable. Some people live in refugee camps, lack of electricity, internet connection, devices. So even at the point when they sign up, they might have access to a learning center in the camp or something where they have access to all those things, but things change. You know, the organizations that are there to support them at the point of sign up may no longer have their funding and so on to continue doing that. So those become very real issues then for people. Lack of a quiet place to study. And then obviously trauma, and trauma has so many elements to it and is not just something that people in the situation of refugees and asylum seekers face. As Helen said, everybody has trauma at different times. You know, some of the people I've been interviewing lost a parent or a grandparent or something during this time, completely unrelated to their situation as forced migrants. But that caused untold, you know, stress and trauma for them. There's often uncertainty about their future. Their asylum status in the country they're living in is like often on hold for years and years. They're in a holding pattern. They're in a second country far away from where they started their journey, and they're hoping to move to a third country, all those things. And from day to day, that can change. Suddenly someone gets the opportunity. So trauma can also have positive aspects where suddenly someone gets the opportunity to go to that third country that they've been waiting to go to for years. And that's incredibly disruptive, and people need headspace to concentrate on what's happening in their lives. So all those things, mental health issues, become part of that. So then the final barrier that I'll list there is just that there are university rules around program structure and the amount of time that a student can remain enrolled. I think it's 4 years or something on this program. That become a barrier at some point where it becomes apparent, because there's been flexibility all along up until the very last minute, where it suddenly becomes really intense that this person has to finish module 4 within this amount of time and then do their dissertation within that amount of time, because the university rules decree that. On the enabler side, on the opportunity side, there is flexibility within that broader timeline, and that really enables people to accept, you know, they have mitigating circumstances, they break off, they come back, and so on. There are soft deadlines. They really appreciate that. They have activities where they can submit an outline of an assignment before they submit the actual assignment. Social learning is massive, and actually it's much bigger than you would imagine from looking at, for example, Blackboard, where the discussion forum takes place. because you look for active engagement, but I'm hearing about vicarious engagement from people who can't actually, because they don't have the device for it, they don't have the connectivity, or they're looking at the discussion forum on their phone on their commute to work, and they feel it's difficult to type in. So they say they're learning, they're appreciating, they're gaining so much from that. There's deep personal engagement with the topics they're studying. Every one of the people I've interviewed has inserted themselves into the story, and possibly because it's about politics and international relations, it's easy for them to do that. They're saying, yeah, they're talking about my country all the time, and I have these experiences of it, and I just felt like they're telling a story I know, but now I'm getting an academic understanding of it as well. So the engagement, the cognitive engagement, is deeply embedded within an emotional, personal response to the content in this subject area. And quite a few of them have been through what seemed to me from the outside like overwhelming challenges and barriers that would have just pushed them into that other side where they sort of fall out of it. But they've persisted, and they've said, no, the learning is healing. The learning is a helpful distraction. So there's a whole lot to do with people's personal disposition as well, and the way they manage to use their agency. So I'll just finish quickly by saying, when they go into that other side, which is where they can't complete the program, they can't graduate, again, they have two choices. One is they contend with the barriers and they find another way. So I've found people who are sort of navigating a new pathway and saying, okay, I have to stop here. I can get my PG cert, for example, after the first 4 modules, but I'm going to apply for another. They're online immediately. They're looking for other master's programs. They're applying. Or they are saying, yep, okay, I missed the time frame, but let me negotiate with the Leicester team and see whether they'll allow me to reapply and start from the very beginning again. And there's only one who disappeared from the program completely, and that person had such a huge combination of all the challenges and barriers, plus injury, plus disability, plus a relocation to a different country, losses of family members and so on, plus having survived torture in a previous part of their journey. That it was, yeah, I think it must have just been that whole combination that caused that. So I'll stop there because I think I've talked too much.
Thank you very much, Gabby, for this contribution. I mean, it will be great to have you back next year, maybe for our Researching Refugeedom event, when you've had more time, you know, to get to an outcome. So before we finish, I mean, we've had a couple of questions. We have one around pastoral support. So it's from Siobhan, who I believe is from STAR, Student Action for Refugees. And she says she would like to hear more about the pastoral support, including the scholarships, and how easy we found it is for students to access pastoral support, and any tips you would share with other institutions. Helen, would you like to comment on that one?
Yeah, I mean, I think obviously, just to say, we're so lucky to have Gabby doing this research. I think that we're going to benefit massively from it, but I think it's such an important piece of research that she's doing, and she could probably talk in more detail about the experiences that our students have had with pastoral support. So we've got to put this within context. Distance learning students tend to have less pastoral support generally from universities for numerous reasons, mostly just resourcing. Unfortunately, we do our very best at Leicester, and I know our DL programme and Jacqueline's as well, to provide as much support as we can for our distance learning students. But, you know, I need to put it within that context, that there is a wider question here about distance learners generally and their place within universities. So our programme is as flexible as possible in terms of allowing people to come in and out, so that we can try and mitigate some of the difficulties that they have. So, they have a personal tutor, although there's difficulties there about maintaining contact. We have a fantastic student support officers within our distance learning administration team who, do far more pastoral care work than they probably formally should be doing, but are essentially the first port of call for most of our DL students and our sanctuary students as well. So this is definitely something that I'm trying to improve. It's something that I know that the sanctuary seekers units are thinking about as well, generally about the pastoral support we can provide. But I think there are unique challenges for our DL students as well. But I think there are improvements within the university as well. It's not easy, but it's definitely something that that I'm very aware that we need to pay attention to.
Can I jump in with one comment on that actually as well, Pascal? I would agree very much with what Helen said there, and I think historically DL students haven't had as much pastoral support as maybe campus-based. This comes from experience of heading up student support in ULSB as well historically. What I would say is I think the pandemic has actually changed how we manage student support, and it has actually opened a few doors for our DL students that had previously been closed, because we've begun to think about student support and how we deliver it in a very different way. So some of the services that we used to offer just on campus are now available virtually. So although I would agree very much with Helen, it's not perfect, and I don't have experience specifically with sanctuary students yet, but with DL students more broadly, I think the pastoral support is improving very much in that space because of those technological changes as well that we've had to go through.
Thank you very much. So we've run out of time, but I wanted to thank you very much for this session, which we hope will be beneficial to other schools, other universities who may be interested in setting up Sanctuary Scholarship for Distance Learning accredited program. As you can see, we really think this has got a lot of potential and can also be really enrich our experiences as universities, enrich our courses, make things more interesting for our students on those programs as we get perspective from all around the world. So yeah, we really would like to encourage you wherever you are to offer a Sanctuary Scholarship for Distance Learning program and give wider access to education so that we can help with that UN objective of increasing access for refugees all around the world.